Let me begin by stating the obvious as you listen to the two texts today. This could sound like a miserable day for women. First, you have the unnamed woman who's got a lot of sin apparently in her life, and then you've got wives, be subject to your husbands. Whew! Well, I want to begin today. So we continue our focus in this 60-60 experiment of 60 days of focusing on the God who loves us and who calls us to love with our whole heart, with our whole person, with our being, our soul, our strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. That I really see at the center of the text today is our capacity to love. So I begin by asking you, who comes to mind for you, first off, as a person with a tremendous capacity to love? And now that you've picked somebody likely in your family or some great saint out of history for whom most of us think, boy, that's unachievable, let me ask you, who's a secondary person that comes to mind to whom you have no DNA relationship? Somebody with a huge capacity to love. You all been able to think of somebody? My guess is that if you were to interview that person, as we see in our gospel text for today, is a person who understands that they have been forgiven much. They're in tune with, they understand who they are. They understand their shortcomings. They understand their failures. But they also have seen and experienced both the love of God and the love of others that has helped their heart, unlike the Grinch, to grow many times over. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about relationships. It's our capacity to love. I begin today with that focus on the gospel woman in the text, who regrettably appears and leaves the story without her name being mentioned. But you did catch what the man's name was, right? Because it's really the man who gets caught in this story, and his name is Simon. And in this particular story, Simon, who wants to have a great lunch as a Pharisee with Jesus, who prepares a great meal, has a great meal prepared for Christ, and Christ sits at the table with him, enters this woman, who in Luke's gospel says she has many sins, but who amongst us in this room today is going to throw the first stone, eh? You see, when we recognize our own perception of ourselves and we honestly assess ourselves and recognize that I do have some shortcomings, I do have some failures, perhaps we can appreciate this gospel story for its true meaning as I understand it. And it has to do with what Simon is thinking in his heart. Now, how Jesus knows what Simon is thinking. When they declare later in the text, if you were a prophet, you would have known who this woman is and that she is sinful. If you were truly a prophet, if you knew how to understand what's going on in other people, Jesus, you wouldn't allow this woman in the room. Interestingly, Jesus as a prophet knows what Simon is thinking, and he knows that Simon is judging the woman. How many of us have not been out in the crowds with people, whether it's a sporting events at Harlem High School, at your own high school, you've been at the mall, wherever you've been, and you have not looked at other people and somehow had a judgment? Huh? I want to begin with one of the most common judgments, just as a site of example, that has unfortunately been carried forward in our culture, and that judgment is about size. And most of the time when I mention size, you notice what my hands did? Because that's mostly where we judge size. We rarely judge size, but we judge size. And where we're most critical oftentimes is women being critical of women and their size, right? And men who have also been critical of women with size. What is it about it? How many of us look at people of size, talk about people who have a size issue, and we say, oh, I'm concerned about their health. You know, the first thought for many of us is, thank God that's not me. Or we usher some kind of judgment. And so we pass this on within our family systems. It's gets continued within, and somehow we think that we are rising above when we can judge somebody else based on some difference in their life. Isn't that right? We somehow think we're better. And we pass on these stories and these traditions. So if you turn to the last verse of our first reading for today, in verse 9 of Ephesians, it begins with this phrase, and God shows no partiality. This is coming at the end of the master and slave text, but I think it's key to interpreting how we view and how we look at other people. God looks at the world. God looks at people and sees no partiality. There isn't a good, better, best. There aren't purple ribbons, blue ribbons, red ribbons, and white ribbons being given out. And for some people, maybe no ribbon even extended. Unfortunately, we have been scripted, all of us, with some limited vision. Second example, we might look at people and their disability and somehow, again, judge what that person can or cannot do based on their quote-unquote disability. And when we allow ourselves to be stripped of the opportunity to build a relationship with someone who's visually blind, somebody who is auditorily challenged and cannot hear, somebody who is unable to get up and move outside of their wheelchair, whatever the disability might be, and we somehow pass judgment or allow our discomfort to get in the way of building a relationship with another human being, perhaps a neighbor or somebody who works on a different floor at the place we work at, or somebody that we see at the mall or in the shopping area. When we don't engage in conversation, who gets shortchanged? And what else are we communicating to that person based on our inability to overcome our anxieties? The list goes on and on. The list goes on how we miss out on the ability to grow our capacity to love. And that's where I see the text directing us today, because it's all about relationships. And you see, God has placed around us all kinds of different people, all kinds of different gifts, all kinds of different perspectives in life, that as we entertain conversation and build relationships, we find that we are enhanced. But it's overcoming our bias, Simon. It's overcoming our bias, Simon, that says somehow I am better than someone else, because that's what restricts our capacity to love. Now, I could cite examples of people with large capacities to love here at Grace. But you see, how it's going to work is this. As soon as I name somebody and you say, oh, I know them. I knew them in junior high, and here's something, Pastor, you don't know about them. You see, then we've already moved to judgment. And so therefore, I have to bring in examples from the outside, people you don't know, because then you don't have any bias on what their shortcomings are. But let me tell you about Clarissa, who I've mentioned before, who's at 85 years old, was still going to court as a layperson, was still going to court for people in their late teens and early 20s, people living in poverty, people who were caught into situations, yes, where they may have contributed to their own problems, most assuredly, but Clarissa could cut through the nonsense, and she would go forward, and she would represent them in court. She would work for their benefit. Now, you might say, 85 years old, Pastor, we should all be at P.A. Peterson when we're 85 years old. You know, just enjoying our leisurely retirement. Huh? No, I don't see hands going up saying, sign me up. When the time comes, yes, it's a great place to be. But Clarissa didn't see retirement at 85. She saw an opportunity to continue to use her God-given gifts and to work on behalf of others. She didn't demonstrate bias based on economic difference. She didn't demonstrate bias based on racial or language difference.